Welcome to Liberty Alert with Gregory Seltz, sponsored by our friends at the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty here in Washington, D.C., a program that cuts through the chaos and confusion in the culture today by talking two-kingdom citizenship, bold, biblical principles for a robust, public Christian life. And now your host, Dr. Gregory Seltz.
Good day, Washington, D.C. I'm Gregory Seltz. Welcome to our program, The Liberty Alert, where every week we try to cut through the noise and take on the issues, especially the public issues that matter to people of faith, applying and relying on the wisdom of the Word for the sake of the culture and the mission of the church. Or as we like to say at the LCRL, we're trying to put our temporal liberties to work for the sake of the eternal liberties of God for all. Today, strategies for dialogue again, but to kind of answer the challenging question, I hear this a lot when I'm out speaking among the church. I say, we need to tone down the rhetoric. It implies that we're the ones that are ramping up the discussion or throwing gasoline on the fire. And so we're going to talk about that today. We're going to need to talk about the fact that there's two different worldviews that are hitting when we start dealing with these things. There are some folks who manipulate language, create narratives, versus other folks, and these other folks are religious oftentimes. Christians are like this, but other people are like this too. They think there's truth, and they think there's moral clarity. But if you're not playing by the same rules, how do you dialogue with someone who doesn't believe there's any truth or moral clarity? It's just about language. We'll talk a little bit, we'll illustrate this by dealing with the Texas abortion law. Is it really Texas Taliban time? So tone down the rhetoric or gut the false narrative head on. This is going to be tough times for those who have a caring, moral view of life, especially people of the book. And you know what book I'm talking about. So moral perspectives first, then politics, if at all. And we may be entering into a time of a here I stand moment, not just for ourselves, but for others too. And I think the right frame of mind is that for any of these dialogues, so we're not standing for these things to protect ourselves. We think they're right for ourselves, obviously, but for others as well. So life is back in the news. Actually, it's been back in the news for a couple of weeks. And since it's in the news, I thought it'd be helpful to illustrate how to engage a controversial topic from a Christian perspective, or even broader, from a Judeo-Christian worldview perspective, while answering the criticism that we got to tone down the rhetoric as if the church and its people are the ones causing the rhetoric to be inflamed. Now, it's always interesting to me is that charge of the rhetoric's getting way too heated and way too political is always thrown at the church by those who are throwing gas on the fire, as far as I'm concerned, and then demeaning any common sense response to that to stand down and just watch things burn. And so that's why I go to our example. One thing that's been in the news is the Texas ruling, and it's limiting abortion. It's one of those things that's limiting abortion into that 14, 15-week category. And any restrictions on abortion just brings out these incredible screams of outrageous claims in the response. And the worst of them was calling people of faith, calling people of goodwill, calling people who defend the sanctity of all life, calling them the Texas Taliban. And, see, when I speak around the country, I've been challenged too that we need to tone down the rhetoric. And so, we need to, I've even heard it said, we need to talk about the sanctity of life, not pro-life, because pro-life is too political. Well, the way this conversation has been framed ever since Roe v. Wade is pro-choice versus anti-abortionist. So why can't we, instead of accepting the way they caricature us, why can't we come up with our own moniker that describes what we believe? And pro-life, pro the sanctity of life, is that statement. And it's not political to respond to the caricature. That's one of the fundamental reasons for this program, the Liberty Alert, but also for the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty. And if you want to know more about that, you can go to lcrlfreedom.org. But our Liberty Alert is meant to make people aware of the issues that demand an answer from the church, and not just Christians in general. Because, Christians can disagree on a lot of different issues and still be faithful to the Scripture. But the church as a whole oftentimes need to speak to specific issues because the Bible speaks to those specific issues. Now, the good news, folks, is there aren't too many of these issues in what we call Caesar's realm that the church needs to speak to. There are many issues where Bible-believing Christians can agree to disagree, be friends and neighbors to one another. But there are some issues that the church must speak on as a church. In the culture, we must honor these fundamental truths, not just for us, but for the culture itself. Now, it's interesting. Jesus differentiates those questions. He says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. Well, this is a Caesar issue. And there are only a few things where the Bible talks about what Caesar's supposed to do. And if Caesar stays in his place and he does those things, then the rest of it is up to free people who have their hearts changed, or free people who come to the Lord, or free people in general, who want to actually try to address these other issues in freedom for the sake of others. Well, it's never good. It's never good to take those kind of conscience issues and give those things to the power of the coercive government over the hearts of human beings. So God even puts Caesar and government and legislators, he's the one who puts them in place for one major reason: to curb our worst outward behavior. I was thinking about this. You have these thing called speed limits, and a lot of people kind of think of them as speed suggestions. And then we have police who police these, and the whole point is that we've created these things so that we can all live in some kind of relative civility. Well, then you got this one guy who just loves to drive 100 miles an hour. What are you going to do with him? He won't obey the rules, he won't obey the laws, and he's doing it so egregiously that it puts a lot of people in danger. Well, that's the whole point of government. Create fair rules, because they're really not the ones who play the game of life. They're more like the referees. And then for those who can't play by the basic rules, well, then we got to deal with those things. But our founding fathers understood that the main role of government was to be limited in those fundamental things. And so if you look in the Scripture, curb our worst behaviors. It's supposed to be good government. It's supposed to be basically a good, fair law and order entity. And that's why justice should be blind. And that's why police forces should have to answer to the local community. The minute you federalize the police force, and there's a lot of people in the defund the police movement who want to do that, now suddenly you have a police force that can be used as a political army against people who have different political views. That's not our culture. Well, at least it wasn't, and hopefully won't be in the future. They also should be maintaining moral teachings that are fundamental to a healthy society. And we'll talk about some of those issues from time to time. So these are things like law and order issues, religious liberty issue, the sanctity of life, and even marriage and educational freedom, which have societal ramifications. We think those are religious liberty issues, and if the government can't limit its role in those things, it should probably get out of it altogether. So that's again why I cringe at the accusation that the church is politicizing many of these issues and is creating incendiary firebrand rhetoric. We're not. We're trying to get the politics out of a lot of these issues. It's crazy that we're the ones challenged with a statement like that we must tone it down, when we're just responding to some of this firebrand rhetoric. So the fundamental flaw, I think, in that statement, when the church is criticized for this, tone it down, is that it assumes that we'll go back to some kind of healthy civility when we turn it down. But that's exactly the opposite of what's happening, because the people who are ramping up the rhetoric keep ramping it up. So today, two-kingdom response. This is a Caesar issue. And it's going to be, Caesar's limited in what he's supposed to be about, and that should help us too. And so the question always is then, what is the government's role in this? That's the question for us. It's not a personal thing. It's not how can I help a person in crisis, or how can I help someone go through a difficult issue. That's a different direction for that discussion. This is, what's the government's role in this thing? So if I'm talking to someone who's already gone through, for instance, the horrors of abortion, or someone who's contemplating that thing, and we need to be coming alongside that person, speaking a gentle word that speaks the truth in love. We want to know that we want people to know that we're here to care and to serve those who are presently afraid or unsure what to do about being pregnant and unmarried, etc. That's the church in action, to speak the truth in love. But that's not what we're talking about with this rhetoric. We're talking about the politics and the political movement of abortion, and the question of what's Caesar's role in this. And right now there are people who think Caesar should pay for abortions. Caesar should pay for women to kill their children. What? If we're talking about the politics of abortion, if that becomes a Caesar issue, it talks about Caesar devaluing human life, when Caesar's role, or the government's role, is to protect innocent life. That's their main role, to protect good people, and I'm using the word good in terms of people who obey outwardly the law. Not necessarily, they still may have issues and corruptions and things like that, but they're not going to be driving 100 miles an hour down the street. They're just not going to do that kind of stuff. So the devaluing of human life, the industry of actually killing millions of children, making money on that, selling body parts as if they're legitimate stock in trade, disregarding the real needs of mothers, children, and yes, families with fathers who are part of the baby's life, by the way, and they're not supposed to be put out for pasture by our legislation. I just read this article last week, I think it was, and it was about dogs that were not adopted, that they were in the kennel, and they had to finally put them to sleep. And it was a heartbreaking thing. Pets just abandoned, and no one would take them. And so they had to euthanize 75 animals. And all of the responses came in. Oh, this is terrible. We should never be doing this. This is ridiculous. Those poor dogs. And in that same week, when there was an article about the Texas law coming into effect, and people were proud that this one abortion doctor did 67 abortions in one day before the law took effect. Wow. New York politicians and a mayor who lit up New York, I think it was either the Freedom Tower, could have been the Empire State Building, lit it up pink when they voted the most outrageous killing of children bill in the history of the world, letting kids die up to the 9th month and beyond, even if they're born alive. It's crazy. Or then this Hollywood influencer who talked about having more babies. He already had a bunch with several women, talked about it, and someone said, do you want more kids? And he said, sure, if a woman wants to be with me, what am I to say no, because it's a beautiful thing. But the child, that kind of stuff, that's her choice. Well, we've created this notion that when the dad has no part of that kid's life from the very beginning. Well, I can tell you right now, that's really, really terrible. From the children's point of view. That kind of fatherhood is not going to raise healthy young boys and girls ready for the challenges of life, even when a dad doesn't even give a damn for you. No wonder you don't trust teachers, police, neighbors. And then boys and girls become vulnerable to all kinds of forces in this culture. So, it just doesn't surprise me that when this rhetoric against common moral sense becomes so outrageous, and we hear that we're called the Texas Taliban when babies are being saved. Taliban kills. The abortion industry, if you want to know the truth, is the Taliban industry. They don't make, they don't just make, they don't come alongside mother and child to help. Like the Taliban, they don't cover just the faces of the babies. They kill them, they dismember them. They demand that right up and through the 9th month. That's the reality behind the rhetoric. And so again, how do we deal with these euphemisms and demonizations? Because that's a tactic that is being used against people of goodwill, people of conscience. People who know and believe that there is things like the sacredness of life, that human life is unique, it needs to be protected, and that the state's most fundamental responsibility is to do that. Another thing, the Supreme Court is going to take up the Mississippi abortion law, I believe, on December 2nd. So we'll be talking about praying about those things as the time grows near. But again, when you start to think about, just think about what the rhetoric is going to be before that day comes, because the main issue is viability. There are people who believe that if the baby's not viable, then you have the right to kill it. The more vulnerable, less viable a child is in the womb, the more the right the woman and the doctor have to burn it to death with saline solution or dismember it to death with the process of abortion and then vacuum it out of the womb, count the baby parts and throw away the remains, or even some trying to sell it. And all bills of sanity to the contrary of that are demonized. They're never discussed. They're never dialogued about. They're demonized. They're called these incendiary names. So here's the truth again. As we get closer to that ruling, or at least the defense of that, or arguing before the court, America has the most radical abortion laws in the world in the West. And in the West. In the Western world, abortion is only and up to the 14th week. Virtually every abortion law in America, except in some of the more conservative states, is well beyond that. Even the Texas law is reducing it to that level of that the rest of the world says is the sane level of things. And yet we're supposedly the ones that are inflaming the rhetoric. Pro-life bills are merely trying to reduce the outrageous notion of abortion on demand without any restrictions. You know, when the baby has a heartbeat, when the baby can feel pain, you shouldn't be able to wipe out its life. Pretty reasonable, right? Then why are we called Texas Taliban, and why are we the ones being challenged to tone it down and the like? And I think that's where we're going to have to start learning how to take this stuff on. And so I think instead of, look, we don't want to be flamethrowers in return, and we're not going to caricature our opponents on this politically. But again, you do have to take this stuff seriously, because it creates the notion that they are the common sense ones. They are the ones who really care, when in reality, they're the ones who have the least care for the women, the children, and the society at large. So the first thing is, remember who you're talking to and what you're talking about. These are not personal issues of people suffering, who have suffered through this, or who have been convinced to do this and then regretted it, or any of those kind of things. This is the politics. This is what's Caesar's role in the abortion industry. And we got to be wise as serpents here. We're oftentimes harmless as doves, but this is one we got to be wise as serpents, ready for the political fight, because our culture depends on it. This political issue, it has been hoisted on the country, and I know it's tough to say no in a culture that says there are no no's in life. You know, we're in a libertine culture, no to any sexual practice, where there's no to any sexual practice, no restraint with sex outside of marriage, no value in the uniqueness of a father and a mother to their children, even though there's lots of data to the contrary. And we do know there's supposed to be proper barriers to all of this stuff for the sake of a society. But then here comes the bomb-throwing rhetoric being used to silence common sense folks who disagree. So we've got to take that on. We've got to take that on. You know, there is truth and moral clarity that cuts through this. And we're going to have to dismantle some of the narratives or the euphemisms or the demonizations. We can't play by their rules. If they start to tell us you can't respond, or else we're going to call you those who are ramping up the rhetoric, well, what they're really basically doing is creating rules where they can do as they please, and you can't respond even in kind, or you can't even respond at all. So we're not going to play by those rules. There are moral truths that demand our obedience, everybody's obedience, because they're true. And there are narratives that obfuscate or relativize or personalize moral truths as merely my choice, and those things are deadly socially, culturally, and spiritually. So, you know, the first thing we've got to do is say it's outrageous that someone would say this is Texas Taliban time. That is outrageous. And no person of goodwill, I don't care what network they're on, I don't care if they're on CNN, MSNBC, or Fox, no one should be allowed to caricature people of goodwill with that kind of rhetoric. So yeah, tone it down. That's outrageous. And I didn't hear anybody saying tone that down. actually tone it down or take it back. And if they won't take it back, then turn it on its head. You know, it's one of the ways that we've been talking about race and racism and supremacy on this program, because supremacy is built on the Darwinian secular notion of the survival of the fittest. And yet, for some reason, they hoist all that kind of talk on the church. Well, the church, there's no foundational truth for race and racism in the Bible. The Bible is the one that undergirds the Declaration of Independence, you know, that we all have inalienable rights because they're created by God. There is one human race. But Darwin and Margaret Sanger and those who were classifying type of folks, where they classified by outward, criteria, and that included the shape of foreheads and eyes and all these things, kind of thing like that, and color of skin. That's where this supremacy stuff came from, survival of the fittest stuff. And we've always argued against this. So, hey, Darwinist, hey, secularist, you're the supremacist, and you need to actually either explain why you still think you can be that, or be like us and rebuke that and turn it on its head. Our fundamental teachings are against it. Our foundational teachings of this culture, which we always haven't lived up to, they're still against it. And so we're not the ones that have explaining to do here. Margaret Sanger does. And yet it's so incredible to see in the abortion industry, for instance, that the person who actually thought, you know, getting people to kill their children or killing their children through abortion was a better way to come up with the master race. And she started with the poor and those of African immigrant descent. They've got the explaining to do. So tone down the rhetoric. I say the better thing is to gut the firebrand rhetoric that's being hoisted against us. You know, turn that on its head. And even if we do a good job of that, it's going to be tough times in the near future for moral people of the book, moral perspectives on life. But I say again, even as you get into politics, because all politics is about morality. Every law is a moral principle in legal form. So first we got to get our moral perspective right. What's the foundational truths that we know are true for everybody? Then politics, if at all. So this may become a here I stand moment, folks, but you know, if you understand what here I stand really means, it's not that we're just cantankerous and we just want to stand up for something and we'll stand there no matter what. No, it's here I stand for you. And when the Bible tells you to stand for the truth, it's because the truth will set everyone free. And those moral truths of the Scriptures always are in service to the good news of the gospel in the Scriptures, and we need to stand for the whole counsel of God for the sake of other people. So, you know, one of the ways that the pro-life movement has done a great job of constantly turning this rhetoric around from the bomb throwers who call us these names is they continually, with humility and grace, start to talk about what it means to be pro-life, why sanctity of life is so special. And pro-life should not be a political phrase, because it isn't. It's just that we're pro the sanctity of life. And so they want to demonstrate that the sanctity of life is pro all human life, pro woman, pro children, pro science. By the way, you know, for those who keep talking about trust the science, science says life begins at conception. That's the DNA answer. Now the Bible says the same thing too. In this case, they both agree. But this notion of when does it become a person and viability, so as if it's not able to live on its own, then you can do with it as you please. Well, I'm sorry, but I don't think you're going to, even when kids are outside of the womb for the first 8 months, 10 months, 12 months, 2 years, they're still not able to survive on their own. So can you do with them as you please then? And what about pro-fathers and pro-community and pro-civility and pro-empathy? Those are all pro-life. And then pro-repentance and forgiveness for those who have been ravaged by this, that's a pro-life message too. So remember too, when someone accuses the pro-life community of being the culprit, remember the abortion industry makes money on every abortion. It's always trying to expand the baby parts market. It doesn't care for prenatal or post-birth care. It doesn't care about the physiology or psychological damage to many women who've had it. It also doesn't have a defensible boundary to their practice. Because if choice is the only issue and choice is personal, then again, a baby's viability in and out of the womb are always going to be vulnerable. And, the fear and the callousness that's created by this, oh man, it's incredible. So the sanctity of life perspective demands that we love one another. There's no doubt about it. That we struggle with one another, bear each other's burdens as we seek to empower people to live virtuous lives. But that's the point, is that there are foundational truths that give us wisdom to do just that. And thou shalt not murder, and thou shalt protect innocent life. That's the kind of thing that is fundamental, not just to the Christian church, it's fundamental to society. So, let me say it again. If we're going to, take up this challenge, this is a practice that's barbaric on its face. And it's amazing that we don't know more about the whole Gosnell debacle. Most people in our society don't know anything about this one doctor who saved baby parts and committed all kinds of terrible practice abortions all throughout his life and really did this at the expense of women. And yet our society doesn't know anything about him, relatively speaking. But we claim to want to know, everything about this issue for the sake of our culture. So it is prayer time, and it's time for hope in America. It's a time to return to valuing human life. It's a time to kind of call our culture to the dignity of being created in the image of God and what that matters. Because a culture that begins to look at life that way, it starts to look at friends and even adversaries through the sanctity of life perspective. And I don't see, when you start to think that through, I don't see how that cannot be a good thing in the end. So if we're going to, take our place on a lot of this stuff, we're going to have to get ready for the rhetoric that's out there, because it is kind of brutal. And but I think it's time to address these things and to be wise as serpents and take the challenge on, because this is one of those issues that is hitting our culture. It's devaluing life in our culture, and the church has to stand up for that and has to even tell the politicians how they're supposed to actually think this thing through for the sake of everybody else. And to that end, we're going to give it our best. Thanks for tuning in today. To get to know our LCRL DC work better, check out our website at lcrlfreedom.org. Contained there are resources to empower your public square dynamic discipleship. Or check out our weekly Word from the Center opinion piece every Friday at facebook.com/LCRL Freedom. Till next time, God bless you always. I'm Gregory Seltz. Have a great week.
You've been listening to Liberty Alert with Dr. Gregory Seltz, Executive Director of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty in Washington, D.C. This program has been brought to you by the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty.